fellowships. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Today's daf is Avoda Zara daf Nun Gimel. We are picking up on daf Nun Gimel Amud Aleph at the Mishnah, about 7-8 lines in. We begin today's daf by thanking our sponsors. We thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilson family, for sponsoring all the shiurim and all the drushes as eschos for B'suras Tovas for Am Yisrael. We also thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Menachem Av, Stephen and Wendy Drazen, for sponsoring all the shiurim in honor of Israel Drazen, Dina Drazen, Stanley Rosenzweig, and Eileen Rosenzweig. The neshama should have an aliyah, and the family should have an achama. The family should be zeichet to riches yamim v'shalom v'tech brias and nefesh v'brias agof. We're picking up at the Mishnah on daf Nun Gimel Amud Aleph. So the Mishnah says the following: Keitzad mevatla. How does one go about being mevatel and avodah zara? So now, Rashi points out at the end of this Mishnah, this is talking about an akum. It's not talking about a Yisrael being mevatel and avodah zara, because the Yisrael can't. So we're speaking about an akum being mevatel and avodah zara. So the question is, Keitzad mevatel. So the Mishnah gives a number of examples. Number one, kata rosh azna. If he cut off the tip of its ear, rosh chotma, tip of its nose, rosh etzba, the tip of its finger. So again, assuming that this idol had a human figure to it, so cut off one of the extremities. Pichasa, if he smashes it with a hammer, afal pishlo chisra, even if it's not actually missing a piece, nevertheless, bitla, it will be batal. Rak bifanea, if he spits in its face, hishtin bifanea, urinates in front of it, garara, or he dragged it through the mud, zarak ba'ashatzoa, he threw excrement at it, any of those cases, Areyeh zu eina betela, it does not become batal through doing any of those things. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says eina betela. Why the lefum shaita rasach alev v'hadar palachle? He temporarily got upset as avodah zara, so he did these disgraceful things in front of it. But he'll come around and he'll come back and he'll start serving the avodah zara again. And therefore, those things are not considered to be permanent actions that would take away its status of avodah zara. Where actually he causes physical damage to the avodah zara to the point where he can't reverse it. So he cuts off a part of the avodah zara, or he smashes it. In one of those cases, that is going to be a case where it's batal, and it is batal for good. Now the Mishnah ends off with a machlokas. Machra o mishkana. What happens if he sells it, or he gives it away as a mashkin, as a collateral? So he borrows money, and he gives it away as a collateral. Rabbi Omer, Rabbi says, bital, becomes batal by doing one of those things, by selling it, or by giving it away as a collateral. Chacham say no, it still retains its status as avodah zara, and the fact that he sold it or gave it away as a collateral does not take away its avodah zara status. Now the Gemara says, going on to the case of pichasa, where he hits it with a hammer, Mishnah is very clear that if he hits it with a hammer, even if it's not missing anything, in other words, it's still fully intact, the halacha is that avodah zara becomes batal. So the Gemara wants to know kilo chisra, but my bitla. How does it become batal? How does it get nullified by virtue of the fact that he smacked it with a hammer? Everything is still here, it's still fully intact. What he did was he whacked it in its face, so it became disfigured. Rashi says v'kilkil tzurasa. So it had a certain look to it. The avodah zara had a look to it, and when he whacked it with a hammer, so it became disfigured. Imagine if it was made out of metal, so it got completely bent out of shape. So even though it's not actually missing any of the metal, no part of it is actually missing. But the fact of the matter is that since it is disfigured at this point in time, and it can't just be fixed up, you can't take it to the body shop and just fix it. In such a case, it's considered to be ruined, and it's going to become batal. Now the Gemara goes to the cases where he violates it. The examples in the Mishnah: Rokak b'faneh, he spits in front of it, v'hishtin b'faneh, or he urinates in front of it. And the Gemara asks, "Mina hani mili." Where do I know this from? That those do not constitute a nullification of the avodah zara. Rechizkiah responds and he says, "The Amarkra for the pasuk says, v'haya, and it will be kiyirav, will be hungry, v'skatzef is going to get angry. What's going to happen? What are the avodah zara going to do? The kilo b'malko be'elohav. They're going to curse their king and their gods. What are they going to do then? Beautiful things going to happen. Upana lamala, they're going to look up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. However, unfortunately, the next pasuk says, "Uksiv basrei ve'el aretz yabet v'nitzar v'chashecha." Ultimately, they're going to gaze down towards the land, which refers to the Avoda Zara. So again, yes, there is something called temporary inspiration. In this case, it seemed like it was kind of like a desperation inspiration. When he got desperate, he said, "You know what? What's my Avoda Zara worth anyway? What's it doing for me?" So he looked up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but ultimately, yes, he got angry at his Avoda Zara, and he turned away from it, but that did not last. So therefore, unless a person does something permanently to stop them from serving their Avoda Zara, like completely disfiguring or destroying their Avoda Zara, there's always a chance that the person is going to go back to it. The kilo malchus, says the Gemara, even though he cursed his king Velohav and his deities, upana lamala, still what's going to happen? El Eretz Yabet, he's going to go back to serve his Avoda Zara. Gemara goes on, Machra, he went ahead and sold it, O Mishkana, or he gave it away as a collateral. So our Mishnah mentions machlokas between Rabbi and the Chachamim, where Rabbi said, if he did any one of those things, it's going to become batal. According to the Chachamim, it's not going to become batal. Now we have a machlokas here. The Gemara says, Zeiri Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav. You have these two people, Zeiri in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and Yirmiyah bar Abba in the name of Rav. We don't know who said what, but the Gemara says, Chad Amar machlokas betzoref oved kochavim. Their machlokes is where the Avoda Zara was sold to a tzoref, to a smelter, to a metal smelter, who is an akum. Aval b'tzoref Yisrael divrei kol bito. If the akum is going to go ahead and sells Avoda Zara to a tzoref Yisrael, to a Jewish smelter, everyone's going to agree it's going to become batal. The Chanavar, the other one, disagrees and says that b'tzoref Yisrael machlokes, there is machlokes even when it is sold to a Jewish smelter. Now, Tosfos points out, and essentially Rashi says the same thing. Rashi says a little more vaguely. If you look at Rashi, you can see Rashi says, line before that, in the middle of the Rashi says, Stam lokche mateches sarfimheim. Most people who buy things made out of metal, the reason why they buy it is because they're metal workers. And therefore, they're probably going to do some type of metal work with it. Now, Tosfos is much more clear about it. The top Tosfos says, Lav davka tzorif. When we're talking about a tzorif Yisrael, a Jewish smelter, it's not specifically talking about a person who has a sign on his front door that says he's a blacksmith. Dafilu she'eno tzorif, even if he's not going to be a blacksmith or a smelter, nami de kol Yisrael gabi avodas kechav b'tzarfim. All Jewish people, with regard to Avoda Zara, we view them as smelters. In other words, don't get stuck on this point that is a tzorif Yisrael, not a tzorif Yisrael, because we're going to see later on, Tosfos points out, later on we're going to have a question. The question will easily be answered by just saying, oh, this person is talking about just a regular Jewish person. In that case, it's talking about a person where the Jewish person happened to have been a blacksmith. So Tosfos just says, when we say we're talking about a tzorif Yisrael, or a tzorif akum, it's not specifically talking about a person who's a tzorif, but we mentioned that because that's, as Rashi pointed out, Tosfos actually says it because since we're talking about a tzoref ovid kechavim, we mentioned that the Jew as well. But again, it doesn't specifically have to be the case. But let's get back to this. The Gemara says we have two different opinions: Ziri in the name of Rabbi Yochanan and Yiri bar Abba in the name of Rav. Where one of them says machlokes between Rabbi and the Chachamim is talking about betzoref ovid kechavim. Now it's clear in that opinion, Aval betzoref Yisrael, when it comes to a Jewish metal smelter, Divrei Akal Bito, everyone agrees that it becomes batal. Now, in the other opinion, Chadam B'tzoref Yisrael Machlokas is even talking about a Jewish person who purchased this Avoda Zara. Now, the Gemara is not sure exactly what that means. Therefore, the Gemara goes on a slight tangential question. Ibayalahu. We have a question. When we say that there's Machlokas, B'tzoref Yisrael Machlokas, does that sentence finish off by saying Aval Tzoref Ovid Kechavim Divrei Akal Lo Bito? In other words, let's finish off by saying the machlokes is by a Jewish person who buys the Avoda Zara. But if it would be an akum who buys the Avoda Zara, everyone agrees it's not batal. O Dilma, no, maybe bein bazev is a machlokes. In other words, is he just adding on the machlokes is in both cases? So how would this machlokes play out? According to the first opinion, machlokes is by tzoref over kechavim, but by tzoref Yisrael, everyone agrees it's batal. In other words, if you look at Rashi, Rashi explains what's the thought process over here with Tzarech Oved Kechavim. Shemachra Oved Kechavim L'Tzarech Chavero. He sells it to his friend. Hasam Kami Rabbanan D'la Batla. In that case, the Rabbanan are going to say it's not batla. Why? What's the thought process of this akum who sells it to another akum? The Savra Mocher Kivin Lokeach Ze Oved Kechavim. Since the buyer is also an Oved Kechavim, who palach la v'lo tavar la. In other words, his thought process is, yeah, I know the guy's in the metal business, but I'm not just selling him a chunk of random steel that I found while I was demolishing my basement or something like that. We're talking about a person I'm selling him an Avoda Zara. So what's the akum going to think? He's going to think he's not just going to melt that down and turn it into some scrap metal. What's he going to do with it? He's going to serve as Avoda Zara. However, by Tzorf Yisrael, he's not going to think that way. If you look at Rashi again, Avamacha over Kechavim from Tzorf Yisrael, V'stama Batla Midaite Demeide Yada the High Tavarla. He knows I'm selling Avoda Zara to Yisrael. What's he going to do with it? He's going to melt it down and turn it into metal. So now we're not sure exactly if the other opinion, who says the Machlokes is even by Yisrael, do we say the Machlokes is by Yisrael, but by an akum, everybody agrees it's not batal? That's something we're not so clear about. So the Gemara is going to try to answer that now. Go ask the question again. But Tzarech Yisrael Machlokes, in that opinion, it says Machlokes is even when the akum sells it to Yisrael. Avol Tzarech over Kechavim Divrei Akol Bitel. Are we going to say when it comes to an akum who buys it, everyone agrees that it's not batal because you assume you're still going to use it? O Dilma, or maybe perhaps Bein Bazeh Machlokes. The opinion it says that it's even by selling it to a Yisrael. That's the same, but there's still Machlokes when it comes to an akum. Tashema, the Gemara tries to bring right. The Amar Rabbi, who's one of the members of this Machlokes. The Amar Rabbi, Niren Devarai Kishemachro Lechavala. My words were more accepted when it was sold for damage. In other words, when it's sold to be destroyed. V'divrei Chaverai, and the words of the Rabbanan who argued with me and said that it's not batal. Shemachro Le'ovda, when it was sold to be served. In other words, Rabbi says it's batal. So he says, my words were accepted by the other chachamim when it was sold to be destroyed. My words were not accepted. In other words, the opinion of the chachamim was accepted when it was sold to be served. Then the Gemara says, hold on a second. Ma'ila chavala u'ma'ila ovda. What does it mean when it was sold to be destroyed or sold to be served? Ilema l'chavala mamish. It was actually sold to a company that has a big, huge sign in front of it that says, bring us your metal, we'll melt it down to one big sheet. So then the Ovda Mamish, they bring it into a second-hand Avoda Zara store. My time of the Madamar Bittel, my time of the Madamar Lo Bittel. In other words, it doesn't make sense to have Machlokes over there. If we know he's destroying it, so then everyone should agree it's going to become batal. If we know he's repurposing it for Avoda Zara, everyone should agree it's not batal. What does this mean? Why is there even Machlokes over there? Gemara says, Elalav, it must be that he was not saying that it was talking about where you knew specifically, clearly what was going to happen to it. Elalav, what it meant was, L'chavala, when he said, people accepted my words. L'chavala, which meant L'misha asid l'chavla, to a person who most likely is going to destroy it. Who's that? Umanu Tzaref Yisrael. That's a Jewish metal worker. A Jewish metal worker is most probably going to melt it down. So, of course, if everybody knows it's going to be melted down, there's no machlokes, there's nothing to talk about. That's called destroying an Avodah Zara. However, if we're talking about a person who's most likely going to destroy it, that's Yisrael. Sorry, let's go back one line. What does it mean? It was sold to be served. To a person who most likely is going to serve it at the end. Umanu, who is that? So what do you see clearly? Because he went ahead and said my words versus the Chachamim's words. And he said my words were accepted, their words were accepted, and he gave a machlokas both with regard to Yisrael and with regard to an akum. So what do you see? We see from here, machlokas. In that opinion, machlokas is true whether it's sold to Yisrael or to an akum. Gemara says, no, that's not a raya. Lo hachi karma. This is what it meant to say. Amar Rabbi. Rabbi said, Nirayin divarai, my words were accepted lichaverai to my words, lichaverai to my friends, to the other chachamim, kishamach lichavala. In other words, Nirin divarai lichaverai, what he means to say is there's no machlokas over there. We're all on the same page. In other words, if you let's look at that Rashi. Rashi is the second to last skinny line. Lo. L'olam b'tzaruf Yisrael afilu rabbanan bito. Even when it comes to a tzaruf Yisrael, to a Jewish person who's buying this Avoda Zara, everyone's going to agree, even the Chacham will agree it's batal. Now, v'haidik amar Rabbi nirin divarai, my words are accepted, kishamachar lechaval, when it's sold to be destroyed, lav de pligi rabbanan alea, is the first wide line in Rashi. It's not that the Chachamim are arguing on him in that case. It's not that. What I'm saying is that in that case, people accepted my opinion over my rival, the Chachamim, who are arguing with me. Ella, rather, what it means to say is, Rabbi lefrushe pluktayu asa. He was just coming to explain where is there a machlokus. Ulashminu is coming to teach us the betzorei ovid kachavim hupligi. We're only arguing, myself, Rabbi, and the Chachamim are only arguing when it comes to a purchaser, to a metal worker who is an akum. V'hachi kamar, this is what he was saying. Nirin devarai l'chaveirai umodem hemli. My words were accepted to the Chachamim, and they agreed to me kishemacha lemi she'asad l'chavala. If it's sold to somebody who's ultimately, eventually going to destroy it. In other words, who are those? The Chachamim agree with me when it comes to selling it to Israel. In other words, so there's no machlokes between Rabbi and the Chachamim when it is sold to a Yisrael. So again, we did inside the Gemara. The Gemara says, "Lo hachi kama amar Rabbi nirin devarai lechaverai kishamach lechavala umanu tzaraf Yisrael she'af chaverai lo nechleku alai." Chachamim do not argue on me. El kishamach le'ovda. That's only when it's served, when it's sold to someone who's going to serve it. Avo lechavala. If it's known or assumed that it's going to be destroyed, moduli they agree with me. Okay, now the Gemara wants to bring a raya. Meisvei. Let's ask a kasha. Halokech grew to os over the kachavim. Person buys scrap metals from an akum. So he buys, I don't know, a whole carton of scrap metals from an akum. As he's going through it, he finds some Avoda Zara mixed into all those scrap metals. The Gemara says, Im achlo nasan mos mashach. If he did meshicha on this whole carton of scrap metals before he gave the money, then yachzir. He can go ahead and return the whole thing to him and say, he can return the Avoda Zara to him and say, I don't want to have this. Im mishinasan mos, if he already paid for it, and then he did mashach, he did meshicha on it, yolach liyam melach, he has to go ahead and take the Avoda Zara and throw it into the yam melach. In other words, he can't return it, because in such a case, it's going to look like he's doing business with Avoda Zara. He can't keep it because it's Avoda Zara, so what's his only choice? Throw it into a place where it will never be retrieved. Now, if you're going to tell me that this machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi is true even when the person buying it is Yisrael, so Hamani Rabbanan. It makes sense. This is the Rabbanan. In other words, Rabbanan are the ones who told us that when you sell it to a Yisrael, the halacha is that it's not batal. So here we have a case. An akum sold, in essence, Avoda Zara to a Yisrael. What's the halacha? If he bought it, paid for it, did meshicha on it, now the Yisrael owns it, what's he got to do with it? Throw it into the Yam HaMelech. Perfectly fits the Rabbanan. If you're going to tell me the machlokes is only when you sold it to a non-Jew, and in that case it's the machlokes. Aval b'tzaraf Yisrael, when we're talking about an akum who sells Avoda Zara to a Jew, Divrei called Bitel, everyone's going to agree that he's mevatel. In other words, what's the thought process? We mentioned earlier, when an akum sells an Avoda Zara to Yisrael, what does he think is going to happen to it? He thinks it's going to be destroyed. That's what Yidden do with Avoda Zara. Now, in that thought process, what's going on over here? The akum sells a whole truckload of scrap metals to the Yisrael. Included in that truckload is Avoda Zara. Now, if it's true that every time it's sold to Yisrael it becomes bato, why does he have to throw it into the Yam HaMelech? The akum was mevatel it by virtue of the fact that he sold it to a Jew. Gemara says no. Who's going to be the author of this? Gemara says no. Shani Hasam. That case is different. Why that do krutos zavin There's a very big difference between an akum carefully packaging up an avodah zara and putting it in the window and selling it, than a person who just sells a bulk amount of scrap metals. When he's selling bulk amount of scrap metals, I don't know, he went around on the day before bulk pickup with his broken down pickup truck, and he picked up as much scrap metal as he possibly can, and he strapped it onto the back of his truck, and he sold it. He doesn't know what's in there, he doesn't care what's in there. He's selling it to the Israel by weight. He doesn't care what's inside the back of the truck. So we can't get into the thought process of, oh yeah, he was selling it to Yisrael, and he had in mind that that piece of Avodah Zara that was among all that scrap metal in the back of the truck, that he was mevatel by selling it to Yisrael. He just was selling a large amount of scrap metal to the Yisrael. He didn't think about being mevatel the Avodah Zara. Whereas our Mishnah is talking about a case where a person took one individual Avodah Zara and sold it to Yisrael. In that case, why are you selling the Avodah Zara to Yisrael? Must be you mevatel the Avodah Zara, you nullify the Avodah Zara. So therefore, this case has nothing to do with what we mentioned earlier in our Mishnah. Tana Rabbanan. Now the Gemara is going to give some examples of cases where there's an assumption that an akum was mevatel Avodah Zara. Lava aleh. If a akum took out a loan on an Avodah Zara, which means basically he gave it as a mashkin. He took a loan and he handed over his Avodah Zara as a mashkin. Osha nafa le mapoles, or there was a building that collapsed on top of it. Osha ganvua listim, or if it got stolen. Osha hinichua bailim v'achlim dinasayam. The owner of the Avodah Zara moved out of town and he just left it in the basement. Oh, no. So now the Gemara says, Imasidim, top of Megimel Mabeis, Imasidim lachzor k'melchemes Yeshua. If these non-Jews plan to return to the original place like they planned to do with the Mechama of Yeshua, the Gemara is going to analyze this in a minute. Eina B'Tela. It's not Batal because they plan to come back and get it. But obviously the flip side of that is, if they don't plan to come back, it does become Batal. So now the Gemara says, V'tzricha. We have to have all these cases. We couldn't just mention one, we have to have all of them. If we only have that case where he used it as a mashkin for a loan, we would say, midelo zavna, lo bitla. You might think for the fact that he didn't actually sell it, it's not batal. Avol nafla, alea mapoles. I would say, however, if the house fell on top of it, I would say, midelo kamafani la, from the fact he's not going back to clean it up, ema bituli batla, tzricha. I'd have to have both. In other words, in these cases, we're assuming if there's any chance he's going to come back, it's not batal. So now, when it comes to the loan, I'd say from the fact that he didn't sell it, it's not batla. But not for mapolas. When it comes to the house that fell on top of it, I would have thought, from the fact that he's not digging in there to go get it, then ema bituli batla. No, tzricha. No, he's not mevatel. Maybe we'll come back and get it another time. Itana nafla ala mapolas. If you only have the case of nafla ala mapolas, I would say mishum de savar. You know what? You know why in that case it's not batal? He thinks han manches. He's leaving it, and kol emes tebina shaklina. It's protected. It's perfectly fine under a pile of stones. Nothing's going to happen to it. It's the best possible place for me to keep it safe. So therefore, it's there. Avol ganvua listim. I would think, well, however, in a case where thieves came and stole it, midolo kamahadra abasur. He's not chasing after them. He hasn't gotten his whole family together to run after them and get his avodah zara back. So I would say the fact that he's not doing that, bitul mivato. So no, we still have to say that if he plans to go back and get it, it's not batal. Tzricha. Now, if we only would have listed the case of ganvua listim where thieves stole it, I would say mishum desavar I over kachavim shakala miflach palachla. He thinks in the back of his mind, you know what? The guy's a thief, and I might not ever get it back. But guess what? The guy who's a thief might also be an over kachavim just like me. When he finds out what he stole, he'll serve the avodah zara himself. So therefore, he says, you know what? I'm not going to move out to the avodah zara. At least someone else will serve it. Yisrael shakla, I did the mea yikarim, and if it's a Yisrael who took it, in other words, on the flip side, if it's not an akum who stole it, but rather Yisrael, I did the mea yikarim, since it's worth a lot of money, what's he going to do? Mizben la over kachavim. He'll probably sell it to another akum. In other words, this is his thought process as to why he's not mevatel avodah zara, because he thinks either an akum got it and he'll continue to serve it, Or Yisrael stole it and he'll sell it to another akum. Aval hi nichua bailim. If the bailim, the owner of it, just left it in his basement and moved out of town, I would think this be mevatel it. So the Gemara says, no, tzrich, you have to have all those cases to tell you that if he plans to come back, it's not batal. Now the Gemara goes to analyze that line of the Masidim Lachsa K'Melchemes Yeshua. Masidim Lachsa K'Melchemes Yeshua ain't a betel, it's not going to be batal. Now the Gemara says, hold on a second. If they plan on coming back, like they came back after Melchemes Yeshua, Gemara says, Midi Melchemes Yeshua Mihadar Hadar, he didn't come back. The Amorayim that he went to go ahead and fight never came home. They thought they were going to come home, but they lost the war. Yeshua wiped them out. Where it says, "Hachik Amar imasidim lachzar harel kimlechemes Yeshua from the ein la betela." In other words, if they plan to come back, then it's not going to be batom like the Melchemes Yeshua. In other words, it's just what they plan to do. V'lamali limitli Melchemes Yeshua. So why do you have to have it depending on Melchemes Yeshua? What does that have to do with anything? Just say if they plan to go back. Where it says, "Milsa agav orchi kamashma," is teaching us something on the side. Yehuda Amar Yehuda Amarav Yisrael shezakaf levena l'shtachavosla u'ba'od k'chavim v'shtachavala asra. The Gemara is teaching us something fascinating about what happens when there's a Jewish intervention in Avoda Zara. So you have this person who went ahead, a Yisrael, who stood up a stone. Came up earlier in the Masechta. Yisrael stands up a stone, having intention to go ahead and bow down to it. Now what happened was he didn't do that, but an akum came ahead and went ahead and did that. The halacha is the stone becomes asur. Minalan, how do we know that? The as hamilan. Gedamar Yehuda Amarav Yisrael shezak leveni l'shtachavosla u'ba'over k'chavim v'shtachavala asra. Minalan, the asra. How do we know it's asra? Amar Lazar kitchila shel Eretz Yisrael. It's like the beginning of Eretz Yisrael. The Amar Rachmana, it says in the pasuk, the Asherayim tishrafim be'esh. The Asherah trees in Eretz Yisrael have to all be burned in fire. Nemechti Yerushal hi lahem me'avoseim. Eretz Yisrael. It's not like new property. It's Yerusha from Avram Yitzchak and Yaakov. It's always been owned by Yidden. So the Ein Adam also Davar Shein Shalo. No one has the ability to go ahead and to ask for something that doesn't belong to them. So Eretz Yisrael always belonged to the Yidden. The fact that it was temporarily out of the Yidden's hands. How do the people who are living there have the ability to create Avodah Zara, things that don't belong to them? Now, Mishum Hanach Temei Kara. It should be enough. In other words, if it's just because of those people who were there originally, that bit should be enough for. The Gemara says something fascinating. While the Yidden served the Egel, at that point in time, Galu Adaitayu Denichalahu Avodas Kuchavim. When Klal Yisrael went and built and served the Egel, that was a public declaration that they were okay with Avodah Zara. That's very similar to standing up a stone. A Yisrael goes ahead and stands up a stone, Chalila, and he goes ahead and he demonstrates, he declares that he is okay with people serving Avodah Zara. Then an Akum serves the Avodah Zara, it becomes Asur. Similarly, when Klal Yisrael went and built the Egel, that was a public declaration that they were okay with people serving Avodah Zara. So at that point in time, when the Akum came in Eretz Yisrael and served the Avodah Zara there, Shlichusa, the two Avdi, they were essentially just working on behalf of Klal Yisrael. Very heavy statement over here. So Hachanami Yisrael Shazak Levena, Yisrael goes ahead and stands up a brick. He's ultimately revealing that he's happy with Avodah Zara. When an Akum comes and bows down to it, Shlichusa, he's just acting on behalf of Klal Yisrael. Now, and that's ultimately why we're mentioning this idea of Yeshua, because it's relevant to the Asherah in Eretz Yisrael. Gemara says, now hold on a second. How do we know that just because they served the Egel, that is relevant to Avodah Zara in Eretz Yisrael? Maybe they're okay with serving the Egel because there was a circumstantial problem they had over there. They got confused with Moshe Rabbeinu. They thought he was late, thought he wasn't coming back. The Satan confused them. So they built an Egel over there. How do you know that is something that was ultimately a revelation that they're okay with Avodah Zara in Eretz Yisrael as well? The Gemara says, Amar Kar, the pasuk says, Ela Elohecha Yisrael. They declared, these are our gods for Yisrael. They used the plural language over there, so they had a desire for many Avoda Zara. Where it says, hold on, maybe it means only what was done there, but from there on in, everything else could be mutter. Where it says man muchach, but how do you know that? In other words, if you look at Rashi, man muchach, it's impossible to know what was there and what wasn't there, and therefore everything is going to be included. Next Mishnah. Avodas kochavim shehinichua ovdea, Avoda Zara that was abandoned. It just was left behind. So the Mishnah says, b'shas shalom, in times of peace, mutaros. B'shas milchama, if people were fleeing because of war, asura, then we assume that they just left it because they didn't have time to take it, but they weren't mevatel it. So again, there's a difference between a person abandoning Avodah Zarah, we assume that they were mevatel it, and a person leaving in such a hurry, they're all harried as they run out, they don't have the ability to think about, what do I have, what don't I have, they grab the essentials and run for their lives. So now, if they just left b'shas milchama, it's going to be aser. And the Mishnah says, musios shel malachim harei ulu mutaros. These are mutar. What are they? So Rashi says these bimusios shel malachim is avnei gazis, these stone things, hamusukanim bederech mahalach hamelach. So kind of like these pedestals that they would place along the road when the king would come. Ukshamelach over moshivin sham. So when the king is planning to come, they would decorate the roads or the pathways with these pedestals, and they'd place Avodah Zaras on top of these pedestals. So Mishnah says, mutaros, these are mutaros. These pedestals do not become aser. Why? Because it's placed there when the king passes by. Now this doesn't seem to be a reason that makes much sense, doesn't really give much of an understanding. Get to it more in the Gemara, but just to see Rashi says, Kolomar mipnei shetzarach lahamida b'shasha malachim ovrim. They have to put it up there when the king passes by. She'enon muchanos l'moshe avodas kechavim kol shah el osasha. It's only temporarily placed there when the king passes by for temporary Avodah Zarah serving. L'kamei parach mishum hachi mutarim. To me, in other words, what does that do with it? Who cares if it's served all the time temporarily? We'll get to that in the Gemara in just a minute. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav, Beis Nimrod, Areyeh kavodas kechavim shehinichua ovdea b'shas shalom umuter. Beis Nimrod, that's talking about the story of the Dara Flaga. When they went and built Migdal Bavel, he says that's considered to be a place where they abandoned b'shas shalom, and it's muter. Afgav techi b'darinu rachmana k'shas milchama dami, ibayis mahadar hadar. Even though they all scattered, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mixed up their languages, and they felt all tzafleigen, they had no idea what was going on. They didn't know what they were talking about. This guy said this, the other guy said something else, and it was a major mix-up. It was chaos. They just ran away from there. Still, when everything settled down, they could have gone back. And the fact that they didn't go back shows that they were mevatel. Now, getting on to these cases of these pedestals. Bimusio shamalacham areyeh mutaros. The Gemara asks, the fact that they place it there at the time that the kings pass by, that makes it mutter. What type of logic is that? That should be the opposite. This is what it means to say. Since they place it there when the malachim pass by, kings are unpredictable. You never know exactly which way they're going to go. Maybe even for security reasons, they don't disclose their exact travel route before they go. They say we're coming to a particular town. So those people who live in those towns, they're going to go ahead and they're going to decorate all the possible roadways that the king is going to take. And then what happens is, sometimes the king ends up showing up. He doesn't even bother going down those roads, so it doesn't even end up being served. So, and therefore, these pedestals or these posts that he put out, they're going to be mutter because it's possible, or it's likely in most cases, they weren't even served. Ki asa ula Yosef abimsa pegimo. And Ula came, he needed to sit down, so he sat down on one of these chipped pedestals. Amar le Yehuda la Ula. Yehuda said to Ula, Ula, why are you sitting on this? V'haravu Shmuel, Amri Tarvayu, both Rav and Shmuel say, Bimos Shenifgam, if you have one of these pedestals that got broken, Asr, it's Asr to benefit from it. Afil Lamad Amar Ein Ovdim L'Shvarim, even according to Man Amar says that Akum Ovdi Kechavim do not serve broken Avodah Zara. Hani Mili Avodah Kechavim, that's the actual Avodah Zara. Why? The Zila Bei Milsa, L'Miflach L'Shvarim. It's just a degrading thing for a person to serve an Avodah Zara that's broken. However, Avol Hai, this is just the pedestal that holds up the Avodah Zara. Lo Ichbeslei. They don't care to bow down to an Avodah Zara that's on top of a pedestal that's a little bit chipped. So therefore, what are you sitting on this for? This is one of the Meshamshei Avodah Zara. This is part of the Avodah Zara service over here, and you're sitting on this pedestal over here as if there's no problem. Amarlei man yoav lon me'afred derav Shmuel umalin einan. Who's going to give us from the afra, from the dirt of Rav and Shmuel, and fill up our eyes? In other words, he paid him a compliment to say that what you're teaching is something so brilliant and so beautiful. However, he said, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish to Amri Tarvayu, both Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish taught exactly the opposite. They said, Bimos Shenifgam, if you have this pedestal that became broken, it's missing a piece, mutter, it's permissible to go ahead and benefit from it. Even to the man Amar that says, Ovdi Avodah Zara, are willing to serve an Avodah Zara that's broken. Hani Mili Avodah Kechavim, that's the actual Avodah Zara itself. Even if it gets broken, they'll still go ahead and bow down to it or serve it. But Kivan de Pacha, since they served this, Zila Bei Milsa, it's a desecration to go ahead and be Levatula, just be Mevatul. Imagine, this is the Avodah Zara. Avodah Zara got a little chip in it. You can go ahead and be Mevatul it. Avol Hani, what are these things? These are just the pedestals that hold it up. Hani Shakli Le Lahai Umaisi Bimasachrina. This is not the Avodah Zara. It's just something holding up the Avodah Zara. It's one of the Meshamshim the Avodah Zara. It's just one of the tools that are used to support the Avodah Zara. It's not such a desecration to get a new pedestal to hold up the Avodah Zara. Tanya Kabasedi Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. So basically, we have two different schools of thought. One of them is Rav and Shmuel's school of thought, which is that when it comes to this bimus, even if it gets damaged, still it doesn't become mutter. And you have exactly the opposite from Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, who teach us that exactly the opposite. It's easily replaceable. If it gets damaged, you'll let it benefit from it. Bimus and nifgam. If you have this pedestal that became nifgam, that got chipped, mutter. It's mutter. Mizbeach, if an altar that was used for Avodah Zara, shenifgam, that became chipped, asr, it's asr to benefit from it. Ad she'inatzeitz ruba, until the whole thing gets smashed. So hechidami bimus, hechidami mizbeach. What's the difference between a bimus and mizbeach? Remember, both of these things seem to be made out of stone. Both of them were used for Avodah Zara service. So what's the difference between a bimus and a mizbeach? Why is a bimus not a mizbeach? Why is mizbeach not a bimus? Both some type of stone structure that was used to either hold up the Avodah Zara, to serve the Avodah Zara. So Amar Yaakov Bar Idi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, bimus is Evan Achas. A bimus is one stone. Mizbeach vanim harbe. Mizbeach is made out of several different stones. So Amar Chizkiah, top of Nidal Amar Aleph, Mikra, what's the pasuk that I have to ultimately help me understand what the difference between a Mizbeach and a bimus is? It says, Besumo kol avnei Mizbeach. The pasuk says, Besumo, he's going to place kol avnei Mizbeach, ke'avnei gir menupatzos, like the stones are all, menupatzos means all broken up. Lo yakuma shreim v'chamanim. So i'ika ka'avnei gir menupatzos, if they're going to be like avnei gir, which are all broken up, lo yakuman ashreim v'chamanim ilav yakumu. In other words, if they're going to be all broken, so then lo yakuman ashereim, then the asherah is not going to be held up. If you look at Rashi, gir kfor, and then lo yakumu shuv lo yakrivu alav. So they're not going to go ahead and serve on it once it's all smashed. The ilav lo nitsu yakumu. If they're not going to smash the whole thing up, then yakumu, it's still going to be established. They're still going to use it. So you see when it says over here, "V'sumu kol avnei mizbeach," that refers to mizbeach that has a bunch of stones. But clearly, what does it say in the beginning of this brisa? It says in the beginning of this brisa, Rabbi Yaakov Idi, earlier bimus shenifgam mutter. So it comes to a bimus, to a one stoned pedestal. All it needs is to have one kind of chip. and that's it. When it comes to a mizbeach, which is a bunch of different stones, that's where it has to be completely minupatzos, smashed into a bunch of different pieces. So mizbeach has to be completely destroyed. At that point in time, lo yukumu, it doesn't survive anymore, can't be used for Avoda Zara. However, when it comes to a bimos, just chipping it is sufficient, and therefore ula, you follow Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, they have a riot what they're saying that it's correct, and that's a sufficient way of destroying that type of pedestal. Stop here for today. Have a wonderful day, and have a wonderful rest of your week. Mr. Hashem will see you tomorrow. Have a great day, Chevra.